Hello, and welcome to Back to the Science. I'm Dr. Susan Oliver, and I'm a scientist, and this is Cindy Oliver, and she's a dog. And we'd both like to wish you a Happy New Year. I did take some time off over the holiday period and hung out with some friends as well as read a few crime fiction books, which is something I do throughout the year because I love crime fiction, but I got to do a bit more than normal over the break. Well, you can imagine my surprise when I decided to catch up on what had been happening on YouTube while I'd been otherwise occupied and found that Dr. John Campbell had also been reading a crime fiction book.
Now, it's Tuesday the 2nd of January, and I know I've gone quiet for a few days, took a few days off, but also I've been spending quite a bit of time on this book here. Now, this is the Robert Kennedy book that a lot of you have heard of, The Real Anthony Fauci, subtitle Bill Gates, Big Pharma and the Global War on Democracy and Public Health by Robert F Kennedy, and you'll be a person that you're certainly quite familiar with if you're in the States.
Talk about a coincidence, hey? Here's the thing though. As I listened further to John's video about the book, it became apparent that he didn't realize that the book was primarily fiction and that he was actually taking it seriously. Of course, John has been slipping down the rabbit hole for quite some time. He started with touting COVID treatments that had no evidence, moved on to downplaying COVID deaths, and then, of course, became a full-on COVID anti-vaxxer. More recently, he has also started promoting unproven cancer treatments and dabbling in climate change denial. But all this pales into insignificance compared with Robert Kennedy Jr.'s book. It's basically wall-to-wall bollocks that only someone with zero critical thinking skills would be fooled by. Robert Kennedy Jr., of course, is not just a COVID anti-vaxxer. He has been an anti-vaxxer for years, and amongst his anti-vax activities was a misinformation campaign in Samoa, which included a personal visit to the country. This is how his fellow anti-vaxxer described that visit. The past few days have been profoundly monumental for me, my family, and for this movement to date. I am deeply honoured to have been in the presence of a man I believe can and will change the course of history. This was a divinely timed, once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and I will forever cherish the conversations and moments we shared together in Samoa, my homeland. WS, thank you, Robert Kennedy Jr. Sort of prayer emoji. Sadly, thanks in part to RFK Jr. and his fellow anti-vaxxers, they did change the course of history. When an outbreak of measles occurred in Samoa in November 2019, the vaccination rate had dropped to 31%. As the death count climbed, Mr. Kennedy wrote to the Samoan government calling on the health ministry to determine scientifically if the outbreak was caused by inadequate vaccine coverage or alternatively by a defective vaccine. The measles epidemic lasted 3.5 months. In that time, 83 people died, mostly children, and 1,868 were admitted to hospital. But Kennedy's book goes way beyond his usual dangerous anti-vax nonsense. He actually stoops even lower into conspiracy nonsense with AIDS denial. And Campbell swallows it hook, line, and sinker. And if you want more details about the nonsense in Kennedy's book, Dr. Dan Wilson of Debunk the Funk has done a series of videos taking it apart and pointing out all the bollocks. John has slipped so far down the rabbit hole, I wouldn't be surprised if his next step is to come out as a flat earther. You may think this is unlikely, but my good friend David Noble pointed out an argument for a flat earth that would likely appeal to someone with the critical thinking skills of Campbell. 70% of the earth is water and virtually none of it is carbonated. So the earth is in fact flat. And for anyone without a sense of humour, this is a joke. I don't really think John is likely to become a flat earther, although he is skirting dangerously close to germ theory denial. But anyway, let's get back to John's video about Kennedy's book. This is how he introduces it.
This book, I'd known about it for some time. And when I actually got my own copy, when I thought I'd have a bit of time over New Year to read it, I was really taken aback by the quality of the scholarship. If this was a PhD dissertation, I would pass it. It is really well referenced.
I have to say, I was totally dumbfounded when I heard this. John is supposed to have a PhD, which means he can use the title doctor, even though he's not a medical doctor. And it's also why I can use the title doctor and why I make it clear at the beginning of every video that I'm a scientist. I do this so that people don't inadvertently think that I'm a medical doctor. I'm not. I'm a scientist. But back to John. As someone with a PhD, he should know the requirements for a PhD. And Kennedy's book doesn't remotely meet those requirements. To get a PhD, you need to perform original research that makes a significant contribution to knowledge in your field of study. And it generally takes 3 to 4 years, although it can take longer in some countries. Even if we ignore the fact that Kennedy's book is total bollocks, it still doesn't meet the requirements of a PhD because it doesn't include any original research. It is just a hatchet job on Tony Fauci, regurgitating tired anti-vax and AIDS denial talking points. It's a narrative, not a piece of research. And he definitely didn't spend 3 to 4 years on it. Kennedy's book is also not structured like a PhD thesis. A key component of a PhD thesis is a literature review. And we won't be able to see this, but anyway, this is the start of my literature review in my PhD thesis. And the reason behind doing a literature review is to identify gaps in existing research that you can fill with your research. You then do that research and document it in your thesis or dissertation, as John uses in his video. This is the table of contents of Kennedy's book. As you can see, there is no literature review. He just plunges straight into his narrative. That is, of course, fine for a crime fiction book or any other book that sets out to put forward a point of view, but it's not fine for a PhD thesis, and Dr. Campbell should know this.
Don't take my word for it. Don't take Mr. Kennedy's word for it. Look at the book and gauge the evidence for yourself. It is really superbly referenced. I think Mr. Kennedy must have had a few research assistants with him on this book, because it really is quite a staggering piece of scholarship. I am really impressed with it.
John seems to think having lots of references makes a work well referenced. But to be well referenced, the references have to support the points being made, and the references need to be representative of the body of literature. This is not the case with Kennedy's book, and I'll just take you through a few examples that John reads out from the book.
As the world watched, Tony Fauci dictated a series of policies that resulted in by far the most deaths. One of the highest percentages COVID-19 body counts of any nation on the planet. Only relentless propaganda and wall-to-wall censorship could conceal his disastrous management during COVID-19's first year. The US, with 4% of the world's population, suffered 14.5% of total COVID deaths. And of course, the UK wasn't that far behind. How much are we influenced internationally? You know, all nations did seem to go in this collective bizarre path what I've called an international folie d'oeil, follow after the most, follow after the person with a mental illness. It's what folie d'oeil means.
Funnily enough, John has actually stumbled on Kennedy's deception here because he knows that the UK had a similar death rate to the USA, but Kennedy hasn't included them in his cherry-picked list of countries. Instead of thinking critically about this, though, John comes up with a convoluted argument as to why other countries had similar death rates to the US. In fact, if we go back to the source of Kennedy's table, which we can find on the Wayback Machine, we can see that the USA actually came in at number 20 in terms of deaths per million, and the UK was number 21. This is, of course, still not very impressive. Neither the US nor the UK did well in the pandemic. But Kennedy's table is deliberately misleading and would hardly be considered scholarly. And of course, Fauci is not responsible for how badly the US did during the pandemic. A large number of decisions related to the handling of the pandemic were made at state and local levels and were not consistent across the country. Whilst Fauci provided advice on a number of issues, there was no requirement for anyone to follow his advice, and they often didn't.
Talking about lockdowns, we have no way of knowing how many people died from isolation, unemployment, deferred medical care, depression, mental illness, obesity, stress, overdose, suicide, addiction, alcoholism, and the accidents that often accompany despair. A June 24, 2021 BMJ study showed that the life expectancy decreased by 1.9 years during the quarantine in the United States.
Okay, this is the BMJ study that Kennedy uses to support his claim that life expectancy went down 1.9 years during the quarantine period. It does indeed suggest that life expectancy went down by about 1.9 years. But it wasn't during the quarantine period. It was during the whole of 2020. And the authors do provide some insight to what they think were the various causes of the decrease in life expectancy, which I'll just read out to you. The decreases in life expectancy that we found and the excess deaths reported in several studies of 2020 death counts could reflect the combined effects of deaths attributed to COVID-19, deaths where SARS-CoV-2 infection was unrecognised or undocumented, and deaths from non-COVID-19 health conditions exacerbated by limited access to healthcare and by widespread social and economic disruptions produced by the pandemic, e.g. unemployment, food insecurity, and homelessness. These adverse outcomes are products of national, state, and local policy decisions and actions and inaction that influenced viral transmission and management of the pandemic. These policies span healthcare, public health, employment, education, and social protection systems. Many organisations are tracking these decisions internationally for ongoing research and development. So lockdowns probably did have some effect, but not what Kennedy is trying to claim in this quote. And Kennedy also suggests that lockdowns may have led to an increase in suicides. We know that this is definitely not the case because suicides decreased in 2020 in the US. What I found really interesting about John presenting this information, though, is that John has been producing excess death videos for some time now and pointing out that they are occurring now coincidentally after vaccines have rolled out. Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. Kennedy's book and the study he references provides lots of other suggestions for why excess deaths are occurring that John has conveniently ignored up until now. What's the bet he will have conveniently forgotten them again when he makes his next excess death video?
Someone published an article, get the book, read about it for yourself, in a scientific journal calling for legislation to expand federal hate crime protection to make criticism of Dr. Fauci a felony. Hate crime to criticise a doctor?
Yes, making it a hate crime to criticise a doctor does seem a bit over the top. Of course, if John had actually checked the reference, which you can see here, he would know that it says no such thing. As you can see from the title, it's about aggression and not just criticism. And it specifically mentions scientists receiving threats via email and on social media, and some being stalked at home. Now, the paper does briefly mention hate crime, but it doesn't say criticising Fauci should be a hate crime. And I will just read you the paragraph where hate crime is mentioned. We should look at expanded protection mechanisms for scientists currently targeted by far-right extremism in the United States. Rep. Paul Tonko has introduced a bill known as the Scientific Integrity Act of 2021 to protect US government scientists from political interference. But this needs to be extended for scientists at private research universities and institutes. Still, another possibility is to extend federal hate crime protections. And you can learn all about hate crimes at the US Department of Justice website. And one thing that the site makes very clear is that a hate crime must include both hate and crime. It can't just be about hate. And specifically at the federal level, hate crime is defined as a crime motivated by bias against race, colour, religion, national origin, sexual orientation, gender identity, or disability. So, what the paper was suggesting as a possibility was that being a scientist could be added to the list of bias categories. There would still need to be a crime for something to be a hate crime. Given Kennedy is a lawyer, he obviously knows this. He is deliberately misrepresenting what was said, and John has gullibly accepted it.
Just a few other quotes, just from the introduction. When I learned that the extraordinary fact, the disastrous health of American people was no longer a mystery, I wondered what the environment would look like if the EPA, that must be the Environmental Protection Agency, received 45% of its budget from the coal industry. Pretty good point. Big Pharma is paying for a lot of the regulatory fees.
Actually, the EPA charges fees to companies that make and import chemicals, just like the FDA charges fees to companies that make and import pharmaceuticals. It's pretty standard for government departments to charge fees. And some of those fees charged by the EPA are quite substantial. For instance, they charge $1,605,000 for an EPA-initiated risk evaluation if you are not a small business. And for a manufacturer-requested risk evaluation on a chemical not included in the work plan, an initial payment of $2,970,000 is required, regardless of company size. The alternative to companies paying fees is for everyone to pay more tax to fund government departments. I am sure most companies would prefer this because it would allow them to make more profits. So I suspect Big Pharma is quite delighted that Kennedy is speaking out against it and that Campbell is helping to spread the message.
In 2020, workers lost 3.7 trillion, while billionaires gained 3.9 trillion. I mean, a trillion must be $1,000 billion. It's unimaginable. Some 493 individuals became new billionaires, and an additional 8 million Americans dropped below the poverty line. So, hooray, Henry, for the 493 individuals that became new billionaires. Pity about the 8 million Americans that dropped below the poverty line.
I have to say that I agree with the sentiment here. It is pretty abhorrent that some people became richer in the US as a result of the pandemic, whilst other people slipped below the poverty line. And it wasn't just the US where this happened. A number of people in the UK also got rich thanks to the pandemic.
Again, in a June 9, 2021 interview, Dr. Fauci, he pronounced that Americans who questioned his statements were per se anti-science. Attacks on me, he explained quite frankly, are attacks on science. That strikes me as, let me think, a little bit arrogant, a little bit complacent. I am the science. Quite incredible, really. Let's get some humility back in medicine. I've just been interviewing in the last video the leading oncologist in the country, in my view, Professor Angus Dalgleish, and he is a humble man, brilliant, capable, great doctor, great academic, but he's also got this humility.
Let's have a listen to Professor Dalgleish being humble in his interview with John.
And I've been horrified at the number of people, specialists, virologists, immunologists, molecular biologists, who don't seem to be able to grasp that. They just keep reiterating.
I don't know about you guys, but thinking most virologists, immunologists, and molecular biologists are wrong, but you are right, doesn't sound too humble to me. As for John's characterisation of Dr. Fauci saying, "I am the science," he never actually said that. John has been taken in again. Here's the clip that people mischaracterise as him saying, "I am the science."
It seems another layer of danger to play politics around matters of life and death.
Right, exactly. And to me, that's unbelievably bad, because all I want to do is save people's lives. That's what I have done for the last 50 years, 37 of which was leading the Institute. And when I see people who scatter around misinformation and lies that can actually endanger the lives of people, but also it is very easy to pick out an individual and make them a target, because that's what people can focus on. But you're talking about systems. You're talking about the CDC. You're talking about the FDA. You're talking about science in general. So if they want to, I mean, anybody who's looking at this carefully realizes that there's a distinct anti-science flavor to this. So if they get up and criticize science, nobody's going to know what they're talking about. But if they get up and really aim their bullets at Tony Fauci, well, people could recognize there's a person there, there's a face, there's a voice you can recognize, you see him on television. So it's easy to criticize. But they're really criticizing science, because I represent science. That's dangerous. To me, that's more dangerous than the slings and the arrows that get thrown at me. I'm not going to be around here forever, but science is going to be here forever. And if you damage science, you are doing something very detrimental to society long after I leave. And that's what I worry about.
So who's more arrogant? The person pointing out that what he is saying is consistent with what other scientists believe, or the person who thinks he is right and all the other scientists are wrong?
So I take some comfort in the fact that someone with Mr. Kennedy's experience was somewhat taken in, as I believe now I was somewhat taken in.
This is one of the most telling parts of John's video. He is basically admitting that he can easily be taken in. What he doesn't realise, though, is that he's being continually taken in by cranks. He just critically accepts any bollocks that one of his cronies spews out. And he's now doing the same with Kennedy's book. He appears to have not checked any of the references and just assumed that they support what is being said. I have just provided you with just a few examples of where they don't, but there are heaps and heaps more.
This wasn't expensive. It was about £14, I think. So, okay, it's £14, but, go halves with a mate or something because you'll both want to read it. It's I'm only about halfway through it really, but that high quality of scholarship is maintained throughout the book. Impressive.
Well, I certainly didn't pay £14 for my book. I got it for free from a local street library. And you'd have to be pretty nuts to pay £14 for Kennedy's book, because there's PDFs available on the internet that you can download for free. Not that I'm suggesting you do that, of course. If you'd like to look further into the data I've presented, I've provided links in the video's description. And please remember, this video is about the science, but you shouldn't take it as medical advice. For that, you should speak to your medical practitioner. If you've got this far, thank you for listening. And if you've liked or commented on the video, double thank you, because that helps the algorithm and means that more people will see the video. And of course, thank you to everyone who has bought me a coffee, or little Cindy here. Wake up, Cindy. No, she's not going to wake up. A treat. We really appreciate your support. We will be continuing to make videos about the science in the future. So if you'd like to join the cool kids, please hit the subscribe button.